Welcome, everybody. My name is Mia Hart, and I'm a junior sustainability consultant here at Turner and Townsend. And we're joined today by Louise Hyde, who's a consultant at Turner and Townsend. So this is a retrofit information support and expertise event, which is fully funded by the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero and delivered by Turner and Townsend. So I will now hand over to Louise to begin today's session.
Thanks, everyone, and thank you for joining today. So, as Mia said, I'm a consultant at Turner and Townsend, and a little bit about my background. I previously studied architecture, and then I'm also trained as a domestic energy assessor and a retrofit assessor. And then have a bit of a background working on retrofit projects over the last few years. So I'll hopefully bring that experience to this session today, the introduction to sort of low carbon heating. So we're really going to kick off with talking about the context of why we need it and what it means, different types, and then we can talk a bit about different considerations for each sort of measure and approach and any sort of common challenges. And I'm sure we're kind of covering, it's quite a big topic. There's lots of innovative measures out there. We're kind of covering some of the main ones and going through them. So first of all, sort of why we need to change how we heat homes and the context of the session today. So essentially, it's a huge part of meeting our net zero targets. And we know that the space heating demand is one of the largest contributions to this proportionally that we need to work on. Domestic sector is now becoming one of the sort of second highest emitting sectors in the UK. So when we talk about how we decarbonise this, we're going to have to go to each home really, and each home is very unique and very different. So it's quite a challenge to actually meet this, and we need to it, and lots of the supply chain as well working on this. So to put it into perspective, so the typical space heating can emit about nearly 2,690 kilograms of carbon dioxide. So if we're to reduce that, then we're going to have to reduce down to 140 kilograms per household. And we'll talk about different targets and things. There's things like we talk about reaching EPCC and so on, and we talk about sort of different heating demands like 90 kilowatt hours square per meter squared, different targets. But really, we just in general need to reduce our emissions from heating demand. So if we go through now on to the next slide, you can see the actual typical energy use in a home. It's water heating and lighting, but the biggest proportion that energy use comes from is the space heating, which I think we do know that, and it's kind of where this all comes from. But when we look at actually where the heat is lost in the home and where to target your energies, and if you've only got certain amounts of funding and certain amounts of time, where can you target this? Obviously, it will vary depending on the house. So that's a typical detached house, but we're looking at like 35% through the walls and then 25% through the roof and slightly lower amounts. Things like 10% through the windows, 15% through sort of external openings, and 15% through floors or vents if it's a subfloor construction as well. So that's just really to guide. I think sometimes we can get so caught up in a project that we maybe sometimes forget, actually, let's go back to where am I losing the most heat from and what should I target my energies on. So there's things like we'll talk about PAS 2035, talks about the whole home approach and thinking about your project. So usually if you go out and retrofit a home, you will be looking at how much of a sort of deep retrofit can you do with targeting everything in the one go. So just looking at that as well. And moving on then, we've got things like the main heating types. So in the UK, we still do have the EPC data showing here from 2024 that mains gas is still one of the largest heating methods in the UK. So we are still needing to do a bit of work on this. There are different types. So that's just driving that data. Obviously, switching everyone over is a huge task in itself, and it's not really going to be just as simple as that. They'll be sort of diversifying and all kinds of different approaches really. So when we talk about what low carbon heating means, essentially it's something new rather than a traditional heating system, trying to move away from gas emissions. So this might be trying to find electrical methods instead, which, because the grid is decarbonising, at a efficient rate. So we're looking at the electrical grid decarbonising quite quickly. So that can be a way then, if you can find ways to use that instead, that can then be a way to bring the carbon down. And we'll look into other methods as well, but really just some sort of way that you can eliminate CO2 or other emissions from your heating approach. And obviously we've come a long way with things like being in the past, like coal and so on, but where we still see the switch in methods, lots of other properties. It could be more rural. They might be relying on an LPG boiler system. They might be really rural, might need that as a backup, and different methods depending on where they are, different solutions depending on the household. So we'll have one method, heat pumps. So different types of heat pumps. You can get the ground source heat pump and air source heat pump with different measures being applicable depending on the situation. Ground source, you maybe need, sort of more garden space and so on. An air source heat pump, maybe slightly more accessible then. And thinking about how this actually works as a technology, it's almost like a reverse fridge. It's using electricity as well. So if the grid's decarbonising, then that can be an approach. I think a lot of people have some concerns around, noise and the size and so on, and thinking about if it's going to actually meet your heating demands and your requirements. It can be that people feel that they're worried about moving to that and might need like backup systems, if there's a power cut and things like that. So you need to consider sort of vulnerable households, and there's things like the priority services register. You can register with your power networks and let them know if you've got any sort of vulnerability requirements. So that could be something to do. And there's sort of myth busting you can do about the noise that an air source heat pump can produce as well. And also sort of planning requirements and what size it is. The government have sort of reformed some of the planning requirements just recently, meaning that, each case we need to check whether you're in like a listed building or conservation area, but they have sort of slightly relaxed some of the regulations around heat pumps to try and increase the uptake of them and make it easier for installs. But yeah, this can actually save, about 70% of carbon compared to a gas boiler. So when we're talking about heating that space, the really significant impact that can have. So hopefully now, and there's lots of different manufacturers out there, there's so many different kinds. I think that's something to consider when you're doing a project, is to think about the maintenance long term of this and all the different types you might have. So really feeling like you can get used to one system and know how that works. And there'll be different qualifications as well. So we talk about with heat pumps as MCS installed, accredited installers for this measure. Yeah, so there's different methods, and the ground source is going to take some heat from the ground really, and take that up and convert it over and be able to sort of convert it into heating the home. And the air source takes it from the air instead. So really, you're still getting heat. There are things to consider here around like a gas radiator will be maybe a bit smaller, whereas the air source heat pump, you might need to have slightly larger radiators in the home, and it's kind of like a more even spread. Thinking about actually how you use the heating demand and how you control it. It's a different system. You might not be able to just come home and sort of turn on your boiler in the same way. Air source heat pumps, it might require just a different approach to understanding the programs and the thermostats and changing that, and really just adapting to that new system. We also have solar thermal heating. This is maybe slightly less sort of common, I would say, but essentially you can put these sort of solar collectors on the panel, on the roof. You'd have to make sure that your roof is suitable, think about sort of roofing works and the load bearing capacity that the roof might have. So that's something that would need to be checked in the first instance. And also even things like orientation. So obviously there are some limitations, not every property is going to have room on the roof to do this. It will depend on your attachment style. It could be like a flat with someone above them and things like that. So maybe not suitable for every single household. However, in principle, the difference being that here using electricity through decarbonising the grid, whereas here working from a renewable power source. So again, bringing that decarbonisation approach into it. And this is estimated to save 70% of the carbon emissions compared to a gas boiler. And yeah, they're very quiet. There might be less of that concern compared to other measures such as the heat pumps. However, thinking about here, you're going to probably have a backup system because it might not be suitable at all times of the year. And yeah, the solar panels, you've got to the right orientation, think about your roof capabilities, and also think about longevity in terms of maintaining this and keeping things cleaner, testing them in line with what you expect to happen on the roof over the next couple of years. So that's one approach as well. There's also the consideration of biomass boilers. So really just almost the same method, but using more sort of renewable fuel sources to add into this. However, there can be considerations about really where your sort of supply chain for these sources was going to be, thinking, I suppose, about travel to go get those sources as well. The solar thermal is on your roof and you're not going to have to go out and go get fuel and so on. And with the air source heat pump, it'll be, coming to you at your property, whereas you are going to find some way to deliver and source your actual fuel source there. And thinking about, depending on what you're using, you might need some sort of storage as well. And thinking about any sort of waste products that might be available in your area. So that's one consideration as well. There are, different types of grants out there you can look into, and this just might be a method. It will depend on the tenants' sort of acceptability or uptake on this enthusiasm compared to other measures and things as well. But again, hopefully not too much of a concern around noise and so on. Electric heating, these now with the decarbonisation of the grid, things can look a bit more favourable. I think in the past as well, we've typically seen that even if someone's got a gas central heated property and a gas boiler, that it can be very common for people to have little electric heaters, just heating it, providing like a boost to one room. And you maybe have these traditional images in your head of like those kind of ones with the glowy bars. So these in the past, but they've come on a long way in terms of technologies and things. And we've also had different uptakes on sort of tariffs that you can get, like night storage heaters, things like that. There are different efficiency ratings, and this is something that does vary quite a lot depending on the model. But yeah, it's also something to consider, and there's different ways you could look at it. It doesn't necessarily have to be on the wall like a panel. You could look at underfloor heating and things like that. So this is also a consideration, especially something if you've got like a high-rise block of flats, maybe their gas wouldn't be suitable. Yeah, thinking again about sort of things like power cuts, things that people might be concerned about. But yeah, if the property is not suitable for gas, this can also be something to consider. We'll move on now to look at the warm home scheme and sort of uplifts or motivations within specific schemes that you can have. So there are sort of uplift opportunities, we'll call them, or low carbon heating incentives. So these are involved with your warm home scheme if you're taking part in that. There might be some variances between social housing fund and local grant, depending on which ones you're taking part in. They do have separate guidance, so please do check those and be familiar with any cost caps that you can have. But it can be that you can only have up to certain sort of percentages and so on. But ultimately, this is to help homes that may be on the gas grid to move over. In the past, there's maybe been schemes where such funding might have only been for off-gas properties, but now on gas as well, just to help the UK move towards lower carbon heating in general. Let's move on now. And again, thinking about your warm home project, thinking about all the things you have to comply with. So this would be in PAS 2035, the 2023 processes. It is a requirement of warm homes funding, for example, and that means you'd have to go through having all the sort of PAS rules, such as a retrofit, assessments, coordination, design, and so on. So all the different measures of that. Also complying, uploading the lodgements with Trustmark, so part of the scheme as well. So looking for someone, an installer who's experienced with that, or hopefully can get involved in that. And that's part of it as well. There's also low carbon heating systems to be installed by the micro certification scheme, so MCS. So there's different versions of that, and it typically goes into some detail on things like heat pumps or PV. It can go into a lot of detail on what you have to comply with. And this is a sort of recap or reminder of the PAS process that you'd have to go through. So following PAS 2035 is a requirement of warm homes, for example, and this means that you'll have to go through the process of having the retrofit assessments done. There's a coordinator who will look at what measures are suitable for the property and work in coordination with other PAS roles. And then this will determine, which measures can go forward, and that is effectively just managed all the way through by a retrofit coordinator. Now we're going to move on to key considerations. So there's lots of things that we kind of have covered bit by bit, on the way there, but just to do a recap of all of them. Heat pumps, there are different kinds, but you're going to, if it's a ground source heat pump, you might need a large space, sort of garden access and so on, where air source heat pump as well, thinking about I mean, we say large space, depends how many heat pumps you have in the home, but if it's typically, like 2 meters by a meter or something like that, is sizable, that you'll need to think about how that's going to be placed. And sometimes, thinking about where planning permissions show that it can't be placed in certain distances of certain things. So to consider that, I'm just going to go think of, site suitability as an aspect of the heat pumps. Solar thermal as well. You obviously the property's going to have the roof's going to have access to the sun, and thinking about shading and orientation and the actual roof suitability, carrying any loads. So NIMBUS typically need like some sort of load bearing assessment, and think about how you're going to access the roof and so on, any shared ownerships like freehold or leasehold, thinking about these types of aspects. Biomass, thinking about where you're going to store your fuel, and considering you're going to have a fuel sort of, you might want to estimate really how much you're going to need and what size of sort of storage you're going to need, where it's going to come from. Electrical heating, maybe slightly less sort of site suitability considerations, but I would say if you're working from high-rise flats or something like that, sometimes gas can't be suitable, so that's it might even sort of mean that this is the most favourable option at times. Then we look at sort of energy efficiency. Heat pump can be a bit variable and will depend on how insulated the property is and so on, and the temperature differences between inside the home and outside the home. Essentially, I think it's a heat coefficient standard. It basically has to sort of pump harder, work harder to transfer from temperature A to temperature B, depending on the variance inside and outside the property. And solar thermal heating, providing an average of 40 to 7% annual hot water usage, and weather dependent, yes. So that's where the backup part might come in, and solar thermal may be, slightly more turbulent depending on your weather. Biomass, it really would depend on where your source of the fuel is coming from. I suppose there's different sort of more waste products might be okay, but it's like where you're getting them from, and that was probably a consideration to think of as the sources and how energy efficient it would be. Again, thinking about the property specifically, on depending how insulated it is and the sort of general efficiency of the whole fabric of the building. So each retrofit assessment through the PAS process can support with what the best measure is. Electric heating, typically may use more energy than a heat pump, so that's something to consider as well. Again, I think that will depend on what kind of models you're going for with electric heating as well. There's different types of, typically storage heaters, different models and so on, and that'll be depending on which ones you use. They measure costs. So heat pump, quite a wide range there, but between, let's just call it 3.5 thousand, 12.5 thousand. So thinking about how long, you might want to look at how long each one lasts for, the maintenance costs and so on as well. And then the energy use itself. So I suppose it's evening out really between, okay, the measure itself might be cheaper but to install, but then do I need to use more energy? So is it actually cancelling out the cheaper install because it needs to use more energy? And also, what are the maintenance costs afterwards? So for me, it's like those three considerations really, because just looking at the install cost can maybe skew your view and make you think that that's the best option. So do consider all these other factors as well. And the solar thermal heating, I would, that about between 3,000 and 6,000. I'd say as well, you might potentially find it slightly harder to find installers that offer that, I think. So to consider that. And obviously you just have to do some soft market testing in your area, or talk to installers in your area and find out maybe who can do it if it's a measure you want to go down the route with. Biomass, a slightly higher cost as well. Think about your cost of fuel long term as well. Electric heating, slightly in the same region of your other measures. So if you look at that and think about, okay, my install cost, maintenance cost, and any other sort of, if it's using electricity, what is the energy demand and how does that factor into my overall sort of cost benefit analysis? We can move on then to, let me check the chat, make sure there's nothing urgent. Yeah, I think we can get into, I think Chris got a good question there on sort of heat pumps. We'll come into that at the end. And then challenges of installing low carbon heating. Well, essentially, not a one size fits all approach, but I think we all know with that in general anyway, that each home you're going to have to go out and consider all the local context and do surveys beforehand to understand. Essentially, you can't really recommend which measure is the most suitable until you understand everything in the home first. And then I think understanding like the tenants' uptake and their acceptance of certain measures. So they might have had a heating system for so long that they might be nervous about switching over to a new one, and helping, even if they're not nervous about switching to a new one also as well. It's just about then that integration of moving towards your new controls. If you've had a gas boiler for like 40 years where you've just had your settings or your thermostat set and it's easy going and that's what you're used to, and moving over to a new system can be a sort of a challenge. So just anticipate that really. And also I think depending, so like air source heat pump, for example, it can actually be, quite a lot of people might have to turn up to that visit and it can take a few days. So just to bear in mind that the install process itself might be a bit different. So if you've got someone who's used to having like a annual gas safety check, or just where it's kind of in and out, test all the radiators and do all that, whereas an air source heat pump install might be slightly more disruptive. So navigating how to anticipate or prepare someone for that, and hopefully then you can get through that slightly potentially more disruptive install process. But obviously with these long-term benefits, it's always just about explaining the long-term benefits to do with carbon and also bill savings, hopefully come for everything all in one. Yeah, different handovers and maintenance. I think if you're a housing provider and you own thousands or hundreds of properties, thinking about how many different technologies you want to be managing, thinking about, well, if you install them all in this year, then when do they then need serviced and so on, moving away from annual gas safety checks and being a thing to how do you maintain and track all the different requirements of different technologies. Yeah, so there's some challenges there, and happy to sort of go into discussions at the end as well if anyone else wants to sort of discuss any challenges they're having. So bear that in mind for discussion points. And then right first time, there can be complaints around installs and post install if the measure's not working. So I think this kind of, for me, kind of goes back to, well, okay, so here's some examples of complaints, but then how do you stop this? How do you stop it happening? And it's all about, I think, contract management, understanding who's taking responsibility if something does go wrong. And that requires you to actually understand the nature of what's gone wrong. So does it sit with the installer? Does it sit with the housing owner, for example? And what documentation does the household get once it's installed? Any kind of warranties, making sure you've got logs of everything, of any certificates that you need to have copies of. Making sure you're got all your scheduled follow-up sort of maintenance visits all planned. So make sure that's discussed with sort of any asset or maintenance teams at the beginning of a project, so that they're on board right from the beginning and it's not going to be a surprise that you've actually not involved them and you've just installed things and so on. So make sure that they're really on board and they can tie it into sort of cyclical maintenance visits that they're doing long term. And also just making sure your tenants know that this is what the process is. So in the past, maybe you could go through schemes or private installers where maybe they could come out and do a survey one day and install a measure the next day and it's all over and done with within a few hours. I think making sure your residents know that this is part of this process means that there's quite a few visits and there's different roles, and it might not be done within, a couple of days. It could be a slightly more long-term install. Maybe engaging with your tenants as well, making sure they understand what the intention and what preferences or concerns they might have. I think if you've got websites, flyers, and you can do engagement and make sure that you're publishing sort of any concerns or FAQs around certain heating technologies or changes that might be coming, so that they can actually prepare in advance. So here's an example here. This is the UK government funded the electrification of the heat demonstration project. Disruption was not a big concern for one person, but it was for another, and therefore the family chose to work from the office instead of working from home during these days. And although it wasn't necessary, they ended up moving out for a few nights. That might suit them. So just thinking about really disruption to everyone's everyday life and what their needs are. So I think understanding the tenant and what their what they're going to need in advance so that you can work with them to find the most suitable solution and really minimize any disruption. And also to communicate this with them a bit. You don't really want to sort of sell it as if it's really, really not disruptive in any way, and then they get a surprise. So just make sure they know that, what's going to happen and navigate that and put them at ease. Yes, and then you can see here a little bit more the installers did their best to minimize disruption. So for me, this kind of goes back to contract management, understanding that the property is going to be left in a certain standard, and that is in everyone's best interest because installers don't want to go back to properties to tidy up mess. So it's in their best interest to do it right first time, avoid complaints, everybody's happy, really. So we have some tips for installing some low carbon heating. Really explain the needs and benefits, what the sort of outcome for them could be. So this can be around understanding really why saving carbon and what that means to them, and the energy bill saving side of things. Anticipating any sort of concerns and considering their concerns they might have. So think about this in your own mind about if I'm getting something installed, I'd be starting to think, okay, well, do I need to pay for anything? What's the maintenance? How disruptive is it? And what's going to happen to my bills? So I think obviously there's hundreds more questions that you might have, but I think go through everything that you would have in your mind and all the questions you would have if it was happening to you, and then make sure you've got some sort of merchandise, leaflets, flyers, website, and so on that can answer these questions and make sure it's easy and accessible for them and that they know that in advance. Advance notice brings us on to advance notice. So the more time you can let everyone know what's happening, explain what's happening, so they can be things like automated reminders that you'd get at the dentist or something, or a haircut. It's just to say, this is a reminder 2 weeks before that you've got your appointment on the 17th of September at 12 o'clock with, I don't know, Solar UK, RUS, something like that. And if you've got any concerns and you want to change your appointment, please, let us know. And also, one thing to consider as well is sort of engagement fatigue and resident engagement fatigue. How can you sort of streamline all different information that they're going to need at different parts of the project? So if they're going to need, I suppose, like almost showing them where they are on the journey as well. So you're at the pre-install survey stage, you're at the install stage. We're now moving into sort of monitoring and evaluation, and they can kind of watch themselves go along the journey. And if you can pile up all the different bits of information that they might need and kind of send that at the get-go, I think that can really help them just feel like they're really taken care of going through the process, rather than sort of adding on, oh, and this, and this, and this. So I think just telling that in advance, bearing in mind that, everyone's got busy lives, and thinking about how can I make this as easy as possible for someone who is very busy, thinking about all the different sort of demographics as well, and different learning styles, formats, languages. If someone wants to request it in a different format, or if you can provide it in different formats from the get-go, that can be really helpful as well. And we have some materials here you can have a look at, and you can also go onto the RISE website and type in the search bars PV or solars or air source heat pumps and things.